So the subject is the mantra and meditation, principles, practices and benefits. Now, most of you may be familiar with different types of mantras. In all organized religions, spiritual traditions, you find great saints and sages have practiced meditation, concentration, and very often in their spiritual practices, they made extensive use of certain sacred word symbols, which are called mantras. Word symbol. It's a very important point to remember. The word mantra is defined in spiritual tradition, Vedantic tradition, as manana trayati iti mantra. This is the ancient Sanskrit definition. A sacred word symbol that helps you to attain the highest spiritual liberation, that saves you from worldly problems, agonies, and all the miseries associated with worldly life, and takes you across the ocean of worldliness. Literal meaning. Now, word manana, I shall explain this little, then we come to the discussion part. Manana means intense concentration. Now, what gives a word its potency and power? Every time, every minute, our mind is thinking of different worldly objects. When we think of any object, there is a corresponding word that comes to our mind. When we think of the mountain, the word mountain is inseparable with the mountain idea. The word ocean is inseparable with the ocean idea. So every object in the world has its corresponding word symbol. They go together, in fact. We can never think of anything without simultaneously forming in our mind a corresponding word symbol. Now, every time, as I said, our mind is focusing on different worldly objects. When we look, mind and eyes come together and we focus on the visual object. So we come to know of something that is standing in front of us. When our mind and ears come together, they focus on the sound that is coming from the vehicle that's passing the streets. So we come to know of the existence of a moving vehicle. Similarly, when my mind and my sense of touch come together, I feel the presence of this paper in my hands. Without my sense of touch, it is not possible. And without the participation of the mind, it is not possible. So mind and the five senses of perception should go together to focus on any visual or audio object. And all these objects have got a corresponding word symbol, which is called names. Somebody, when I put this idea earlier on a previous occasion, somebody asked the question, well, suppose we go to a zoo, we meet an animal, which we don't know the name of. Maybe for the first time we are seeing the strange animal. We don't know its name. Next week, when our mind goes back to that experience, we think of the animal, but we don't know the meaning, the name of that animal. In that case, what happens? The fact that I saw an animal, the name of which I do not know, this becomes its name. And when somebody fills up the gap, well, you know, the name of the animal that you saw last week is X, then that long phrase is replaced by X, that's all. In other words, there is no memory, no thought without a corresponding word symbol. Now, what is mantra? What is the sacred word symbol? To be very direct, I can say this much. Mantras are sacred word symbols which have been used by great spiritual seekers, saints and sages for centuries. When they learn this mantra, they learn its meaning, and then they go on concentrating on the meaning, on the essence of that mantra. It is this concentration that gives that mantra a special potency. I shall give an example. In the four Upanishads, there are four great statements which are called four great statements called Mahavakya. Just one example. In the Chandogya Upanishad, there is one Mahavakya, Tattvam Asi. It's a Mahavakya, great statement, which a sage, a saint, teaches his son. His son was sent for education, but it was a bit too late. The sage was wandering all over the country, teaching and learning in different hermit schools of ancient times. So when they returned home, when he returned home after several years, he found his son had already grown up, 12 years old. He should have initiated his son into his formal Vedic education when the son had already reached his 8th year, but it was very late, or 7th year. So the sage asked, you see, you are too late, you should go to school now. The boy goes to school. The boy's name is Swetaketu, and the son and the father's name is Uddaraka. If you want to read more, you can read the 6th chapter of Chandogya Upanishad. Well, he goes to his school, and after 12 years of education, he returns home. Then the sage puts one simple question to his son. Did you learn that by learning which everything becomes known? Did you learn the essence of all learning, the supreme spiritual wisdom? The boy had not even heard of that kind of education, which enables you to learn the supreme spiritual wisdom which makes everything sensible and meaningful. He said as much. Then of course the teacher, the son, it is the father of the boy, is Uddaraka, teaches him the supreme spiritual truth, the supreme spiritual absolute reality is one divine principle that is present in all of us, which is immanent, omnipresent and transcendent. And that reality is within your own heart. It is yourself, Tattwamasi. This is the mantra. Of course, this comes at the end of it. The 16th part, the 16th Brahmana, 16th section of the 6th chapter of the Chandogya Upanishad. I am coming to the mantra aspect of it. So the meaning of this mantra is the supreme reality, God Almighty, who we are searching, is omnipresent. It is all-pervading and it is present in all of us. You yourself is that supreme reality, not the body, not the mind, not the intellect, not the senses, but the inner divine principle, the supreme consciousness the Atma. This divine principle is within us. God is not creating this world as sitting outside. God is sitting within all of us. This is a simple meaning. Now, for centuries, maybe for thousands of years, great saints and sages have been meditating on this mantra. Or there is another mantra in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. I am in fact not this body, not this mind, not intellect. I am the all-pervading supreme consciousness. Aham Brahmasmi. Like that, all these great statements are there. These great word symbols, it's called mantras, have been meditated upon, concentrated upon by saints and sages for thousands of years. So they accumulate a special spiritual potency. When we become spiritual seekers, when our mind is pure, when we are ready, and when we focus on the meaning of the same sacred symbol, the accumulated spiritual potency of the mantra comes to our mind. This is how mantra and its power are transmitted from teacher to disciple. Well, in our own life we can see, we don't judge a word by its dictionary meaning. We don't do that. Suppose your grandmother scolds you. Maybe she may use a very fair, perhaps somewhat an uncomplimentary expression. You don't get angry with her. You don't go to the dictionary and find out the meaning is certainly not very desirable, so I should take action against her. You don't do that, at least not in civilized society. Because the word was used by your grandfather or grandmother, who had affection for you, who was always thinking about your welfare. So out of love and affection, this word came from the grandmother. Now suppose the same word is used by the hotel receptionist when you go to a hotel to check in, or by the sales executive in the Trader Joe's, when you went there to buy something, and if they use the same word. I don't want to use examples of those words, it's not very proper. But then the meaning will be different. The effect on our mind will be different. Meaning is the same. If you go to the dictionary, whether Webster or Oxford Dictionary, Chambers, meaning is the same. Dictionary meaning is the same. Then what made the difference? In one context, we feel grateful. Many people look back. When they look back, they often bow their heads in gratitude to the great teachers who may have scolded them in their kindergartens. And while scolding, they may have used certain word symbols, which may not have very complimentary meaning. So, the power of the word comes not from the dictionary, but from the speaker. So the speaker, the one who uses the word, renders a special power to the words that he or she uses. Similarly, the great word symbols and mantras find in all religious traditions of Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, the Sufi tradition especially. In all these traditions you find great prayers. Sometimes prayers also they take the form of word symbols. Great statements made by great sages who had this inner experience also assume the spiritual potency of mantras, word symbols. When we repeat the same words with the same spiritual earnestness, they have a different message, they have a different potency, they have a different impact on our mind. And when we repeat them, we become spiritually benefited. Otherwise, you just, of course, I need not give examples. If you tune the radio in a particular frequency of that, suddenly you get BBC, you may get Voice of America. What does it mean? All these words are everywhere. Only you should tune the machine to the particular frequency of it. Then you get these words. Similarly, if you sit in this room and close your eyes and with the sincere, pure mind, repeat word symbols, mantras, which have accumulated spiritual potency by hundreds of years of repetition by saints and sages, then these word symbols will have a corresponding impact in our mind. That's how mantras or word symbols become potent and powerful. This is what really happens in spiritual life. Now, why do we need to utter these mantras? I'm just giving a bird view of some of these ideas. Then I will take up one subject after another, and we will discuss more elaborately during the interaction for 30 minutes. Now, why do we need these mantras? You can read a book and start repeating. Here, there is a very important point to remember, As I said earlier, every minute our mind is distracted towards various worldly objects. Mind is full of thoughts, and every thought has its corresponding word symbols. When we try to meditate, sit calmly, not even meditate, you sit calmly somewhere. Then suddenly you find all kinds of conflicting thought currents suddenly come to the surface of the mind. We never could imagine that we could actually think of those thought currents. We can't even imagine. Maybe a psychologist will tell you, will try to trace the origin of these thought currents and may hypnotize you and may go all the way to your memory formation years where you had certain experiences which created registered a strong impression or tendency in your mind. All these will come to the surface when you try to sit somewhere quietly. Not necessarily to meditate, even to sit calm quietly. All these thought currents will come to the surface. But when we try to meditate, it is all the more so. Because mind is sometimes compared to a lake. A very dirty, filthy lake which has not been cleaned for 2-3 decades. Think of such a lake or a pond. It will be 100 feet deep, 90 feet of water, full of different layers of weeds, filth, dirt, mud and so on. 10 feet of clean water, pure water. So you can't see the bottom. Now if you want to clean up this lake, you take a long pole, you try to stir the lake. Then what happens? All kinds of mud, dirt and filth and bacteria start coming to the surface. Meditation is like that. When you meditate, we are actually trying to clean up this lake. If the lake is clean, the lake can reflect the consciousness Atman. When it is full of 90 feet of dirt and filth, it cannot reflect anything. You can't see the bottom. So when we try to sit somewhere and when we try to start spiritual life, when you start thinking seriously about spiritual life, actually what we are doing, we are trying to clean up the lake. Now, when these thought currents come to the surface, the normal method is we should not fight with them. We should calmly sit without participating. When these thought currents come, we should not be shocked. When good thought currents come, we should not be delighted. When undesirable thought currents come, we should not become depressed. The question is asked, what's the source of these thought currents? As I said earlier, as hypnotists may be able to explain some of the thought currents that are coming to the surface of the mind. Perhaps you may have met with an accident when in childhood days. So, if people start to suffer from psychiatric problems and phobia related to childhood experiences, hypnotists will be able to give a healthy counseling by explaining the association between these phobias and the childhood experience. And that explanation can perhaps help the patient. But there are many memories, many ideas, many thought currents that come to the surface, which cannot be explained in the light of experiences of this life. That's a point. That's why in modern psychiatry, two problems are sometimes explained in the light of experiences not belonging to this life, but experiences belonging to past life. One is multiple personality, the other is schizophrenia, more or less interrelated. Why is it that our mind is full of conflicting thought currents? Very often we find we want to meditate, we are willing to take a strong decision, but then we cannot do. There's a great warfare, fighting going on between what we want to do and what we are able to do. What the mind is willing to participate and what the mind is not willing to participate. Many people are very sincere. When they read a good book, when they listen to wonderful lectures, sometimes they take a very strong, sincere decision where they will bring about a change in their life. But they are not able to do that. Some invisible power appears to create a stumbling block. So this conflict between mind and intellect, an intellect that recognizes the need for starting a new spiritual life, a new chapter in our life, on the one hand, and a mind which tries to prevent. So here we have to explain this in the light of previous life. In fact, this is an important point to understand human personality. And without understanding what we actually are, we will not be able to understand the meaning of mantra and to face some of the conflicts that we face in spiritual life, that we have to confront in spiritual life. So, what really happens is, whatever we have done in this life, we can remember, more or less, with name and form. Very clear remembrances. If something had happened to us in our childhood days, suppose we were chased by an elephant, we may even remember the name of the elephant and also the form of the elephant. So, it is a thought current accompanied by a name and form. But there are many abstract, inexplicable, indescribable thought currents, ideas, tendencies, impressions, which are very strong. This constitute almost 95% of what we are, our personality, our character, and how we live in this world. Cannot be explained in the light of experiences in this life. So both Vedanta philosophy and yoga try to explain this in the light of previous life experiences. Whatever we do, and it's an important point to remember, whatever we do consciously, I am doing this, I feel, well, I associate myself, I interpret myself as the doer of this action, and I interpret myself as the one who is going to enjoy the results of this action. Whatever conscious action we do will create an impact in our mind, a tendency, a subtle abstract tendency, and which is very powerful, which we cannot openly understand. It's not very obvious, but which belong to the lower layers of the mind lake, tendencies and impressions. Whatever we do consciously will create a tendency. A tendency is the residual factor, the subtle factor that is left over of actions. If the results of our actions are pleasant, we will have a tendency to repeat the action even if it is not necessary. If the results are unpleasant, we may have a tendency to avoid the action even if it is essential. In fact, when conflicting thought currents come to the surface of the mind, when we start spiritual life, what is happening is the unpleasant, the undesirable, the non-cooperating tendencies created by actions done in previous life are coming to the surface and trying to prevent. In fact, that's what happens even in normal day-to-day activities. Students who want to study hard, but then cannot do that. Office workers who want to work with great sincerity, but they find themselves, they are not able to do what they would like to do. This can be found not only in the context of spiritual practices, but even in the context of normal day-to-day activities. An ongoing warfare between the will and the mind. Will, I mean in the intellect. We take a decision, we want to do something, we are very sincere. If it is a purely physical action, we will do, because at the physical level, the opposition is much more easy to overcome. But at subtle mental level, the opposition is very difficult to overcome. So, these invisible tendencies and impressions that we have accumulated in previous life sometimes can be helpful, sometimes may not be helpful. So they create so many points of focus. When we sit, when we walk, when we live in this world, mind is distracted to so many diverse focuses of concentration. This mind should be drawn inward. From diversity of focuses of concentration, we should graduate to a single great focus. It's something like this, water is everywhere. But if you want to drink water, you have to dig a well somewhere, and you have to go on digging the well on the same spot. Otherwise you won't get water. Similarly, what happens? Mind is distracted to so many objects of concentration, so diverse focus points outside at the external world. This mind should be turned inward. But we cannot deal with mind as we deal with external objects. With your hand we can take a decision and we are going to do cooking, and we can do cooking straight away. Nobody will stand in your way. But we cannot dictate your own mind. Driving, we can do it physically. We can face the opposition. I won't drive, but I will drive. You can follow your determination to drive and go ahead and drive. But you cannot ask your own mind, you should think this way. If you ask the mind, you should think this way, the mind will certainly start thinking the opposite way. In fact, that's a special trick of the mind. To give an example, I mentioned this sometime earlier, concentration can be from both ends. It is said that one young man who was slowly becoming bald-headed, losing his hair, went to a physician, and the physician wanted to make fun of him and told him, see, you should never think of an open surface. So you should never think of an egg. If you think of an egg, your head will become like an egg. So the man from that day onwards, he was working so hard not to think of an egg, which means every moment he was thinking of an egg and he lost all his hair. Similarly, we cannot ask our mind to think this way and not to think the other way. Mind won't listen to us. So what we need, mind should be given a gradual, a natural, an effortless direction. So if you repeat one sacred mantra, or if you loudly chant one hymn, mind will naturally be withdrawn from all the other points of focus in the external world, and mind will slowly take a turn in. It may not be successful at the beginning. If you start thinking of one sacred mantra, you may be thinking of that. You may think you're thinking of that, but mind should be elsewhere, maybe elsewhere. This is possible. But then gradually the mind gets withdrawn. It may take several years of practice. The mind slowly gets withdrawn from other external points of focus, other external points of concentration, and then slowly turn inward. Now suppose you repeat one sacred mantra, a word simple, with great concentration, with great earnestness. Of course, earnestness or strong desire is a very important necessity for success in meditation and also in the repetition of mantra. Because a strong desire, a strong earnestness drives away all the diverse tendencies, distracting tendencies, and gives an intensity to the practice. So what happens when we try to repeat one sacred mantra? That mantra reduces external distractions by creating a counter focus within ourselves. You are not thinking of a visible external object, but you are trying to think of a higher spiritual ideal, which is represented by the sacred mantra or word symbol. So, the highest spiritual seeker, after several years of practice, can think of God even in a marketplace. Because even while sitting in a marketplace, with all the activities going on around him or her, he can think of the sacred word symbol, if he had practiced with great sincerity and for long years. That means he has succeeded in creating a single counter focus, which neutralizes all the external distractions by providing a counter focus on which he can concentrate. That's why you find great spiritual seekers can think of God even in a marketplace, in a factory, or in the workplace, or in an office. But at the beginning, even in a temple or a church or synagogue or any place of worship, it may not be always easy for a beginner. For some time, we succeed in thinking of the higher spiritual ideas in a sacred place, but then slowly what happens? Mind gets distracted. And how does a sacred place become sacred? How does a temple or a Buddhist place of worship or a synagogue or a church, how do these places become sacred? What's the difference between a marketplace and a sacred place of worship? The difference is this much. That also is related to mantra. In a sacred place, there is a strong vibration which is invisible. Abstract thought currents which are invisible. Created by great spiritual seekers, saints and sages, who have come to that place, who have thought of great spiritual ideas, who have prayed, and contemplated. When they contemplate, these thought currents fill the air. And when you go there, even though you may not be an advanced spiritual seeker, the prevailing thought currents will lift your mind to higher spiritual level. That's why we feel much more easy to pray, to meditate in a sacred place. I remember an incident which really happened in the history of San Francisco monastery. A great Christian devotee, but he was a Christian devotee may not be great because he was a bit of a fundamentalist who believed that Christianity is the only religion in the world, unlike many other enlightened people. So what happened? He came to our old temple. But he was a great devotee in his own way. He used to pray, he used to read the Bible. So in that way, he was very sincere. But when he lived for a few days in the old temple in San Francisco, he felt very happy. And when he was leaving the place, he thought, well, I feel like praying to God when I leave here. He said, I always felt like praying to God, thinking of God during the 3-4 days that I spent here. Now that person had not read anything about any tradition other than his own denomination of Christianity, mind you. No, he was not a Catholic, he was not so he believed only his own independent denomination. But he was a very sincere seeker. So he lived in that old temple. While departing the place, he made a statement to a very senior monk of our order. Well, I felt like praying to God when I stayed here. Now, what really happened? That place was associated with great spiritual seekers. For decades, almost for more than 100 years, great spiritual seekers have been coming. So anybody belonging to any faith, if that person is a sincere seeker of spiritual truth, if you go to any sacred place, you feel your mind is lifted. Because spiritual ideas are universal. So, it is the accumulated spiritual tendencies, associations created by spiritual thought currents that make a place great and sacred. Anywhere in the world, any religious tradition, in any religious tradition, in any spiritual tradition, if you go, if you are a sincere spiritual seeker, devotee of God, or if you are a really good-natured, noble person, you feel an elevation of your mind. That's because of the power of sacred thoughts. And sacred thoughts are created by people who contemplated on the meaning of sacred word symbols. That is the psychology of mantra. So mantras are universal in a way. Mantras are universal non-religious traditions. In every religious tradition, these word symbols are used for spiritual concentration. So, you have to remember, The first important purpose is to create a counter focus for the mind. The mind which is running right, which is running in search of worldly objects, sense objects, get a diversion, inward diversion. And mind slowly start thinking around and on the meaning of this sacred symbol. It is not enough to understand the word as such, it is also important to understand the meaning of the word. Because it is meaning of the word that enables you to think deeply. So the manana means intense concentration, concentrated thinking. When we think of the meaning of a word with intense concentration, we identify ourselves with that word. That's why I shall explain in brief 4 levels of the spiritual aspect of mantra recitation, and then we will have interaction and we will continue the lecture this evening. As I said, mantra is to be understood as a sacred word symbol which creates a counter focus, which helps the mind to turn inward so that we can think of a high spiritual ideal with concentration. There are four levels for mantra. In a way, in a broader sense, it is true of every word, every spoken or written word. The grossest and highest, and then 2 levels in between. What is the grossest? The most audible part of a word. What we hear, the sound vibrations, which we can hear, which is audible, is the grossest. In Sanskrit, it's called Vaikhari. Vaikhari means what you can hear. For a beginner, you may have to shout. Because mind is shouting in so many ways, so many voices mind is creating. So what happens? You may chant a mantra very loudly, or you may recite a hymn very loudly. Sometimes I know there are many denominations who violently repeat some psalm, some hymn. It is good. In a way, it is one way of diverting our mind towards God. Not the best way, of course, not the highest way, but it is one of the many ways. Because mind is running right, mind is shouting otherwise. We can't hear it, but it's shouting, creating noise. So what happens? We also shout loudly, audibly. So what happens? But we are shouting a sacred symbol, maybe a hymn, a psalms, some prayers. You shout. Immediately mind is, in a gross way, turned towards the audible dimension of the spoken word. It's the grossest. The audible dimension of the spoken word is the grossest. That's why sometimes you find this found in all religious traditions. Loud chanting, loud recitation. Sometimes using different musical instruments, because that's how they try to create a counter focus. A Ramana Maharshi or a Jesus or a Buddha will not need to shout loudly, because the mind is already focused. But a person who is going to spiritual kindergarten, the beginning of spiritual life, we may need to practice prayers in a very gross, audible way. As a kindergarten boy or a girl, we have to write very big letters. Then only child will be able to learn. Like that, spiritual beginner, a person who is just entered spiritual kindergarten, will have to shout, recite prayers, hymns, and so on. This is the grossest. Now, what is the highest level? The highest level is when you become associated, when you become one with the essence of that word, that is highest. So, the para or the supreme is one. When you become completely identified, when you establish, when you reach a kind of internal unity with the essence of the mantra, it is the supreme, it is a goal of all human life. Then you don't have to repeat. Your mind is already naturally and completely tuned to the spiritual vibration. You don't have to shout, you don't have to recite loudly. There are two levels in between. So again I will come to the lowest level. Perhaps it is not low, it's a beginning level, let us say. The grossest level. So I carry the audible level. Now the next level is Madhyama. Madhyama means from the audible level, you slowly start thinking of the meaning, the implication, the essence of the mantra, of the sacred word symbol. Then then your voice comes down. Very often, when you go deeper, our voice comes down. That's true in all branches of the spiritual life. When we go deeper, when we understand the true meaning, the voice slowly comes down. Still, we may repeat, but still it may come down.